Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation about brand new global research ISACA has conducted on digital trust. I'm Jay Schwab, Senior Content Manager at ISACA, and with me are Karen Heslop, ISACA's Vice President of Content Development, and Matt Chiodi, Chief Trust Officer at Cerby, and a member of ISACA's Digital Trust Advisory Council. Hi, Karen and Matt.
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
Doing great. We have people starting to join us from all over the world, so let's get started. Please feel free to say hello and where you're from in the comments, and also add any questions you have there. We'll do our best to answer those for you today as we move along. So ISACA has been talking a lot this year about digital trust, and today is a big day because we are releasing our State of Digital Trust survey findings. Quick background, ISACA surveyed more than 2,700 professionals who hold assurance, governance, risk, security, and privacy roles to learn how enterprises are approaching digital trust. We will get into several of the key findings as we go along, but first I'd like to ask both of you, Matt and Karen, to tell me what your big picture overarching takeaway was from the State of Digital Trust survey findings, and if we could start with you, Matt.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay. I appreciate the opportunity to chat about this really important topic. So I really had three takeaways from the report. The first is that I found it interesting that most agree that digital trust is important, but the research shows organizations are not really approaching it holistically. There really seems to be a piecemeal approach, which really isn't as effective. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that just over half, 54%, said they were confident in their organizational digital trustworthiness. But interestingly, only 23% said they actually measure it. This tells me that today, for most organizations, digital trust is largely aspirational. And then the last thing is, again, just over half, about 53%, said the obstacle to obtaining digital trust was a lack of skills and training, while only 44% said it was a lack of alignment with enterprise goals. And I think the truth lies between these two numbers, right? That if digital trust initiatives are aligned with organizational goals, that would get leadership from buy-in for buy-in purposes, and then that would unlock budget, which would lead to the training for the skills required. So I think there's an order to the process, but I'm really excited to kind of go through some of the rest of these findings.
Karen, how about you?
Yeah, and to build on what Matt was talking about, what I found really interesting is when you sifted through the results, you could infer some really interesting nuggets. So, for example, 85% of respondents indicated that digital trust was extremely or very important to their organization. And 66% said that their organization does, in fact, prioritize digital trust. Yet, only 20% of respondents indicated that their board of directors prioritize digital trust. So if you sort of say, well, how do you explain that delta between the 66 saying we prioritize and only 20% of boards prioritize? Well, if you read between those lines, it follows that senior and middle management must, and at the practitioner level, actually must be the people that are prioritizing digital trust within their enterprises. And it just led me to think that, wow, if we were really setting tone at the top, and if boards, in fact, did really prioritize digital trust, how much better could the results be for the consumer and all customers out there?
All right, very, very good. So the survey found a positive reputation to be the top benefit for companies with strong digital trust. Matt, do you agree with that assessment? What other major benefits do you see as a result of organizations being able to build digital trust?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think certainly positive reputation is a benefit, but one thing that we often forget is the human component of digital trust. So this is some research that was done by Paul Zak back in 2017. He wrote this article on the neuroscience of trust, and he's really well known for this. And he found that compared with people at low trust companies, people at high trust companies report 74% less stress, 50% higher productivity, 29% more satisfaction. So the bottom line is that high levels of digital trust will lead to high levels of human trust. They're tightly correlated. And this is actually something that my research team at Cerby is working on. And that research will be coming out in the next month. So stay tuned for that.
All right, great. Yeah, we will stay tuned. So the survey respondents indicate that there's a lot of room for improvement in the way that practitioners in the various digital trust fields collaborate with each other. So we're talking about maybe, from an ISACA perspective, of course, we have a lot of people who work in risk and governance and security and privacy and audit and so forth. And the survey is basically saying that it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of how well those practitioners collaborate with one another, as well as across the organization, because I know that other areas of the organization, ISACA has identified, like HR and marketing and so forth, also have a significant role to play in establishing digital trust. So this question's for you, Karen. Why do you think that some of those struggles with sufficient collaboration are in place, and why is that so important in a digital trust context?
Yeah, Jay, I think that despite all of our collective best efforts and our and the best of intentions, many people still operate in a silo. Many people tend to focus on their immediate departmental efforts and initiatives, and we don't often stop to think about how that work affects others or how it impacts the broader organization, and particularly how it's going to impact trust initiatives or trust concerns within that organization. So, there's obviously a lot of room for improvement, but what concerns me is that lack of collaboration can have really negative consequences. And Matt was talking about, the human factors and culture really, and its impact on trust. So, for example, let's say the security group decides to install new biometric systems on a restricted area. And if the staff feel or perceive those to be invasive, they can ignore them. Those biometric devices are not going to work as intended. So that biometric device was installed to put in increased security and build in a new control. But it start to be pervasive. So, once that starts happening, you're going to start establishing a new cultural norm. So if somebody starts holding the door open, or I'm behind somebody and we get a lot of tailgating going on, it becomes habit. And if the policy is you're not supposed to hold the door open and tailgate for anybody because it's a restricted area, you might think that's your culture because that's what the policy says. But really what your real culture is that everybody just holds open the door for everybody else and violates the policy. And so now we've introduced a brand new vulnerability into the enterprise. And people aren't doing this maliciously, they're just being polite. The polite factor does have a lot of impact in an organization. So again, this was just to illustrate that you can be trying to do the right thing within an organization, but that right thing can sometimes have the exact opposite effect of what was intended.
Okay. So Matt, you're a chief trust officer, but in our State of Digital Trust survey, only 12% of respondents say their organization currently has a staff role dedicated to digital trust. So from your perspective, is that a big problem, or can organizations still achieve digital trust within their current organizational structures, maybe without that dedicated trust role, so to speak?
Yeah, I think focus is really the key to success in pretty much anything in life. At least that's what I've found. But I don't think this necessarily means that every org has to go out and hire a chief trust officer. But there definitely needs to be, from the board level down, organizational goals and metrics that cut across all functions, so digital trust efforts are not siloed. And I think this is what Karen was touching on in the beginning, right? So, for example, at Cerby, I'm the head of trust, and this encompasses things like security, privacy, and marketing for how we communicate about our product. And we especially need this, right? The Cerby platform needs to maintain its high level of trustworthiness because that's our business, right? Our company, we help extend digital identity from identity providers to any application, right? Even those apps that don't support standards like single sign-on. So we're in a high trust position managing access to literally thousands of sensitive accounts globally. So I think, again, organizations, they don't necessarily need a dedicated C-level trust role, but it's absolutely critical that from that board level down, there needs to be digital trust goals and metrics for the entire org. I think otherwise you end up with trust efforts being siloed. Someone says, well, hey, there's a chief trust officer. They've got the trust thing, right? That's on them. And, so I guess I could argue, yes, it's great when an organization like a Cerby and like others who have those head of trust roles, it says, yeah, it's important. But I think you also have to be very careful to make sure you're communicating and making sure there's those organizational top level down goals to make it say like, yeah, we may have a head of trust, but everybody has a role and a metric to work towards to get to digital trustworthiness.
A quick follow-up for you there, Matt. So since you've been in that role as chief trust officer, when you introduce yourself, do people tend to intuitively have a good feel for what that really means and what you actually do, or is there still a lot of education and explanation that you're needing to do?
That's a really good question. I would say that my previous role at Palo Alto Networks, I was the chief security officer. Everybody understands exactly what that is. I never got asked, what does a CSO do? But with the title chief trust officer, I'd say the majority of people go, what does a chief trust officer do? So there's still a lot of questions around that kind of whole concept of trust. Well, what does that mean in a corporate sense? And again, what I usually tell people is it to me, it's wrapping up things that are in security, all things privacy, but also, marketing, right? It's one of the things I think companies have to be really careful about is how are they talking about what they do to consumers, to partners, to even employees. And that's all part of it for us at Cerby. And I think some of the research shows those things are all components of digital trust as well.
Well, speaking of components of digital trust, ISACA has put forward what it considers to be several key components of digital trust. And in addition to some pretty obvious ones that people might assume, things like privacy, security playing in a digital trust, there are areas such as quality, availability, and transparency. So Karen, among those various components that play into digital trust, is there a certain area that you think enterprises have the most work to do, maybe the most ground to make up to really realistically achieve digital trust, or is it still kind of an across the board challenge?
It is an across the board challenge, but I would say I hear a lot of chatter about the quality of data. And, in the age of big data and with the proliferation of data, organizations have more data than ever before. But often this data is collected or filtered through legacy systems and legacy programs, which don't always account for the nuances or even all the attributes of the data. And then organizations are taking that data and making decisions on them, but they're making decisions on potentially faulty or incomplete data. This is really important when we think about it in terms of new technologies being deployed. So think about machine learning. You need to have really clean, good data being used for the machine to learn. And is the output or the learning bias in some regard? So data, I think, is really important. And often it's a really hard nut for an organization to crack because it's getting data from a lot of different places and there's so much of it. So it's just getting your data accurate can be a challenge.
Yeah, I would agree with Karen on that. I've seen that at many companies that, GDPR has been around for a number of years now. I remember kind of in the run up to that, working at, some multinationals, and there being a lot of, let's just say, angst over, how are we going to get our arms around all of the data that we have? And now, of course, in 2022, it's not just GDPR, it's California Consumer Privacy Act. And we just saw, I think it was in the last 2 weeks, that the Irish DPA issued their first fine under the GDPR. So the whole concept of data governance, I believe, is tightly coupled with digital trust, right? If you don't have good data governance, you're not going to have a high level of digital trustworthiness.
Okay. So virtually everyone in our State of Digital Trust survey agreed that digital trust is already important, and 82% say that digital trust will become even more important in the next 5 years. So this one is for Matt. Do you agree it will become even more important in the near future? And if so, what makes you feel that way?
Yeah, I guess I would look at this through a little bit different of a lens. So personal or human trust rather, has in the past always been assumed to carry over into the digital space. And this has largely been a false assumption when we see breach after breach. This is why the concept of zero trust, the concept that I'll actually be talking about on stage at the ISACA Europe event next month, that's why zero trust has become so dominant a force. So you got to remember, right? Trust itself in the age of data, assets, services, and things like that, trust itself is a vulnerability that's been brought into digital systems by humans. So there's this interesting interplay here. So while we want high digital trust with our relationships, interactions, and transactions with providers and consumers, we should aim to have zero trust with our data, applications, assets, and services. And it sounds like an oxymoron, but they are actually inversely related. I mentioned before that at Cerby, we'll be pushing a report out or publishing a report in October that's going to explore this kind of seeming dichotomy in more detail. If listeners want more details and to be notified when that's available, they can just go to Cerby.com. That's CERBY, Cerby.com. If you scroll to the bottom, you can put your email address in there and we'll send you an update when that's available. But the bottom line is that I think the importance of digital trust will increase over the next 5 years as many legacy systems become digitized, right? We saw a massive shift, right? This whole digital transformation is nothing new, but COVID, and we did research on this back when I was at Palo Alto Networks, there was a massive jump to the cloud because of COVID. It actually accelerated a lot of digital transformation timelines. So, as legacy systems become more and more digitized over the next 5 years, this means they'll no longer have the benefit of security through obscurity. And that means that digital trust will become increasingly important.
Let's also touch on the measurement piece of digital trust, because 68% of respondents say it is very or extremely important to measure digital trust, but only 23% currently do it. Karen, how problematic is that disconnect there? And what can you tell us about the status of the digital trust framework that ISACA is currently working on, and how that might be helpful when it comes to measuring and assessing digital trust?
Yeah, I think, what those findings show is that there is a great appetite for the need to measure digital trust. And so ISACA has developed a new digital trust ecosystem framework that we'll be releasing in October. And it gives practitioners and people out there, a mechanism by which they can measure their practices against. This framework is grounded in systems thinking, which is really the notion that, if you change something here, it may have an impact over there. And so it really focuses on how things are all interconnected. So the framework includes high levels of nodes and domains, but it goes into great detail. So it provides practices and activities, idealized outcomes. It provides KPIs. So it's really going to give people the detail they need to really look at what are they doing specifically in the trust space, and what should they be looking for and ways they can improve. If you want to learn more about this framework, ISACA is hosting a webinar next week on 22nd September for members. So if you're an ISACA member, we encourage you to go to isaca.org and look for the webinar and sign up, and you'll hear a lot more details about this framework.
I'm excited about that. I didn't actually know about that. So that's going to be great. I think anytime we can provide frameworks, it's really helpful. Otherwise, people are they're kind of making it up as they go along, right? And then you end up with, every company or maybe every industry having their own definition of what digital trust is, what success looks like. So I'm excited about this. Hopefully I'll get to learn more about it too in the webinar next month. And also when we're in Europe next month, I assume we'll be able to hear more about that. So
yeah, absolutely. And Matt, like you live this every day, right? Trust is, many of us tend to focus more on the technology pieces or the people that work in tech.
Yeah.
Trust is so much bigger than that. Jay talked about it earlier. It's marketing, it's HR, it's any business unit that controls a piece of technology, right? Or uses a piece of technology. And so it really, I think we all have to start thinking much bigger, right? It's the whole organization that contributes to trust.
Absolutely. And I think that, the example you used, Karen, at the beginning when you were talking about, a example of an organization installing a new biometric device, right? Like that in itself is a good, could be a good technological practice to keep, the physical security of an asset more secure, right? But if you don't think about what is the human impact going to be, like how are people going to react to that? How are they going to feel? Then, you're losing out on kind of the human side of it. So I think there's the technological, there's the human side. And I would argue that, I was trying to rack my brain here, trying to think, is there really anybody or any role in any organization that trust doesn't play a part in? And even if you're the maintenance person cleaning a bathroom, there's trust involved there, and there's trust negative and trust positive actions that can ripple their way through the rest of the organization.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's a great note to wrap up on. And so thank you so much for being with us today, Karen and Matt, and thanks to everyone who joined us for this conversation. On that note, please visit the URL on your screen to find several State of Digital Trust resources from ISACA, including a free survey report, several infographics showing the findings by region, expert insights from Matt and others, and additional content. And also, please be sure to join Karen and Matt next month at ISACA Conference Europe in Rome or virtually, where Matt will present, as he mentioned, on Zero Trust, and Karen will share more on ISACA's digital trust ecosystem framework. So thanks, everyone, and have a terrific day.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jay.